Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to tonight's Bible study stream. How is everyone doing this evening? I'd love to definitely see the chat. If anybody's talking in the chat, I definitely just want to say feel free to talk there. That's what it's there for. And what I mean by chat is I mean the comment section on Facebook. The comment section over there on Facebook is where the main chat is. That's what I'm looking at right now. That's what I'm seeing right now. And so definitely feel free to hop on there and just chat. Prayer requests, like anything like that, any kind of questions that you're having along the way, that's where that happens. So yesterday we were going over 1 Corinthians right now. We're making our way through 1 Corinthians so that when we get to 2 Corinthians, we have a little bit more context. Yes, I'm sure there's more context that is throughout the Bible that leads us to Corinthians, especially in Acts and all that. But we're reading 1 Corinthians so that when we get to 2 Corinthians, we have a little bit more context, especially with like how the people of Corinth were and how they are going to be when we get to that second book of 1 Corinthians, that second letter. But yesterday we were in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and that one talked a lot about this issue that the Corinthians were having, and that issue was being when to have sex, basically, is what that issue was. Let's look at some of the notes that we took at the very end of that day. Let me make sure it's going. Yep. So here we go. 1 Corinthians, what they were talking about this issue. Paul says, I'm going to address this issue that you wrote to me about. And it says sex, basically, sex. When should I have it? And the way that it was phrased was more of, is it good for a man to have sex? And what Paul says is, he says, look, if you can't keep it, and this is me putting it in Matt lingo, this is me breaking it down, as he says, look, if you can't keep it in your pants, it's better to get married. Get married. You're not sinning. If you are married, stay married, especially if you're believers. If you're married, if you're married to unbelievers, so if you're a Christian and you marry an unbeliever, stay married. If you're both happy, stay married. Unless the unbeliever wants to get a divorce, then it's okay to get a divorce. Then Paul says, if you're engaged, but you can't keep it in your pants, get married. If you're engaged and you can keep it in your pants, don't get married, because that's the better choice, because you can dedicate yourself to Jesus more. You can dedicate yourself to God more. And then he says, if your spouse dies, you're free to remarry, but it's better not to, for the same reason. Now, Paul does say, he says it a lot in these in this particular section in 1 Corinthians 7, he says that this is kind of his own opinion. This is his own opinion, and these are not commandments from the Lord. However, at the very end of the, we see right here on the screen here, verse 40, he says, I do think that I have the Spirit of God. And I think that I have the Spirit of God. And so what he's saying here is, even though these are his opinions, that he has the Spirit of God dwelling within him, and so he believes that these are spiritually sound teachings that he's giving. But again, he's saying that these are not commandments. He was not given any command from the Lord, that these are just his opinions alone. So that's where we were at chapter 7, but now we're in chapter 8. Now we're in chapter 8. And chapter 8, he's going to be addressing a different issue that they wrote to him about, that the Corinthian church wrote to him about. So here we go. So chapter 8, let's go ahead and let's just dive right in. Let's get started here. So chapter 8, verse 1 says, with regards to food sacrificed to idols. So what they used to do is they used to have this market, so I know that this was a practice in the Jewish temple back in ancient Jerusalem, but I believe it was a practice as well in the pagan temples in throughout Rome and throughout the Greek Roman Empire. And they would take animals in, and basically the priest that was there would butcher it for them. They would burn off the good parts, like the fats and stuff like that, and then they would kind of give them the meat back. They would give them portions back that they could themselves eat, the citizens of Greece and Rome, and even the Jews, when they would go and sacrifice in their temple, same thing. The priests would give them cuts of meat back, and they would take that home with them and eat it. But now some people took those cuts of meat and they sold it in the market. And so you would end up with food sometimes that was sacrificed to different idols. You would get like a lamb's leg that was sacrificed to Zeus, or Apollo or something like that. And so this was troubling, especially if the Corinthians found out about it. They were like, well, are we sinning? Are we sinning? So this is what Paul is addressing. They wrote Paul and they asked him, if we eat food that's been sacrificed to idols, are we sinning? And so this is what Paul says. He says, with regard to food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. So what is that? What is he saying here? Let's look at the footnote. We all have knowledge. In the Greek, we all have knowledge. Here in verse 4, Paul cites certain slogans the Corinthians apparently used to justify their behavior. And then he has these verses here. Paul agrees with the slogans in part, but corrects them to show how the Corinthians have misused these ideas. Paul agrees with the slogan in part, but okay, I see what they're saying. So this might be another slogan where they kind of say, we all have knowledge. We all kind of know what's going on. And then Paul says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If someone thinks he knows something, he does not yet know the degree that he needs to know. But if someone loves God, he is known by God. That's what Paul is saying here. So let's see, with regard to food sacrificed to idols, it's kind of a weird way to go about it, but I think I'm trying to think about it to see if it makes sense. So with regard to food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. So we all know things. But knowledge puffs up, like knowledge that we've gained ourselves puffs up, but love builds up. So he's saying that knowledge is for yourself. It's gonna puff you up. It's going to build up pride within you. But love, you're more focused on building one another up. That's what love is going to do. So he says, if someone thinks that he knows something, he does not yet know the degree that he needs to know. So if you have knowledge, nobody really knows how to use it. But if someone loves God, he is known by God, because that's one of the commandments that Jesus says. He says this was the greatest command, to love one another. So if you love, if someone loves God, then God reciprocates that to him. He is known by God. So here we go. So now Paul addresses it. He says, with regard then to eating food sacrificed to idols. I think that first part is a clarification that, look, if you love God, then you're known by God. And if you know something, you don't really know at what degree you need to know it. So what degree, I'm thinking that what he's saying is, what degree do you need to know that this food was sacrificed to idols? Because again, he says that at the beginning of verse 8, it says, with regards to food sacrificed to idols, and now he's going back into it. With regards then to eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that, quote, an idol in this world is nothing, and that there is no God but one. If after all there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we live, from whom are all things and for whom we live, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we live. So he's kind of saying the same. Now this is a good statement for does the Bible, and yes, it's not necessarily Jesus, but does the Bible claim that Jesus is God? This is a statement right here, where right here in verse 6, for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we live, and our one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. It's equating the two. They're both the same. They're both the same thing, that that all things are, and that whom we live through. So Paul is using that. This is the argument he's going to come by, is that, look, there's no God but one. There's no God but one. And then Paul says, if after all there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God the Father. Now this is not to say, and this is one thing I want to clarify, is if you read read some books by Dr. I'm going to write it here, Michael Heiser. Dr. Michael Heiser, and he actually, in his book, Unseen Realm, he kind of talks about this, not issue, but he kind of talks about this idea that the Jews actually did believe that there were other spiritual beings out there, but that as far as allocating them as they are our God, there's only one our God. There's only one God. There's only one God above all gods. So even if there are gods out there, whether on heaven or on earth, and then Paul even says, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is only one God, the Father, from whom all things are, and for whom we live. And then there's one Lord, Jesus Christ, same thing. So here we go. Verse 7. Verse 7, but this knowledge is not shared by all, and some, by being accustomed to idols in former times, eat this food as an idol sacrifice, and their conscience, because it is weak, is defiled. So what Paul is saying is that there are people out there that came out of this lifestyle of idols, the statues that they represented the god, so they would sacrifice their food to these idols, and then they would eat that food. And so these people are accustomed to that, and so what they associate eating this food with worshiping that idol. And so for them, it's messing with their conscience. And it says because it is weak, and their conscience, because it is weak, is defiled. Because these are probably new Christians, and they're probably Gentile Christians. So when he says and some, that's who he's talking about. He's talking about the Gentiles. The Gentiles who formerly sacrificed their food to idols. So now verse 8. Now, food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. But be careful that this liberty of yours does not become a hindrance to the weak. For if someone weak sees you who possess knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience be strengthened to eat food offered to idols? So by your knowledge the weak brother or sister, for whom Christ died, is destroyed. If you sin against your brothers or sisters in this way, and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. For this reason, if food causes my brother or sister to sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I may not cause one of them to sin. So what Paul is saying here is, look, you're gonna have people, you're gonna have people that see this food as idol worship, and if you eat it or don't eat it, it's not a consequence to us, the ones who are strong. That's what Paul says in verse 8. He says, we are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. So it really doesn't matter whether you eat the food or not. But be careful in this liberty of yours, that this liberty of yours does not become a hindrance to the weak. For if someone weak sees you possess knowledge, dining you who possess knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience be strengthened? And there's a footnote here on 6. Right here, 6, or the 6th footnote here. Or built up. This is the same word in verse 1b. It is used ironically here. The weak person is built up to commit what he regards as a sin. I see what they're saying. So it's almost like you're giving them permission, but they're still going to see it as a sin. They're still going to say like, oh, that food is sacrificed to Zeus, and they're going to see it that way. And they're going to see you eating it, and they're going to be like, man, does that mean I can sacrifice, or I can eat meat that's been sacrificed to Zeus? And it's weak, and it's a stumbling block to them. And so Paul says that you're sinning against Christ. If you're causing them to sin, if you're going to sin against them, you're sinning against Christ. And so Paul says here in 13 that for this reason, if it causes my brother and sister to sin, I'm not going to eat meat again, like at all, so that I may not cause one of them to sin. So meat sacrificed to idols. It doesn't matter unless it causes the weak to sin. That's when it matters. That's how you know it matters. And that causing the weak to sin is to sin against Christ. So now let's continue on in chapter 9. Chapter 8 went by pretty quick. Yesterday we were in chapter 7 the whole time. So here we are, chapter 9. Paul says, and he's still talking. He's still got the same frame of mind. He's still talking about food sacrificed to idols. So he's still got that frame of mind. That's still what he's talking about. So here we go. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you. For you are the confirming sign of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who examine me. Do we not have the right to financial support? Do we not have the right to the company of a believing wife? Like the other apostles and Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I lack the right not to work? Whoever serves in the army at his own expense. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not consume its milk? Am I saying these things only on the basis of common sense? Or does the law not say this as well? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. God is not concerned here about oxen, is he? Or is he not surely speaking for our benefit? It is written for us, because the one plowing and threshing out to work in hope of enjoying the harvest. If we sowed spiritual blessing among you, is it too much to reap material things from you? If others receive this right from you, are we not more deserving? I just said that this has to do with food sacrificed to idols, but it almost seems like he's talking about something different. But I want to keep my head I want to keep my head in the space that he just finished talking about food sacrificed to idols, and that he's still in this train of thought. Because it seems like a weird transition, and it might not be in the Greek, but right now in the English it is. So I'm going to tread lightly here and say that he is still talking about food sacrificed to idols, but he's using this to talk about that, because I think right here he starts talking about eating food in the temple. So let's see what he's talking about here, because right now, basically what this is saying is basically that those who preach have a right to financial support, is what it looks like. Financial support, and a wife. That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to me. But what does this have to do? What does this have to do with food sacrificed to idols? What does this have to do with it? That's what I'm trying to figure out here. So here we go. Let's keep going. We're in verse 12. But we have not made use of this right. Instead, we endure everything so that we may not be a hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple eat food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar receive a part of the offering, or a part of the offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel to receive their living by the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing these things so that something will be done for me. In fact, it would be better for me to die than no one will deprive. Oh man. In fact, it would be better for me to die than no one. I would say that THEN, the way that I'm reading it. In fact, it would be better for me to die than no one will deprive me of my reason for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, I have no reason for boasting, because I am compelled to do this. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if I do it unwillingly, I am entrusted with a responsibility. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights in the gospel. So again, I'm wondering what this has to do with food sacrificed to idols, or did Paul kind of, okay, that was food sacrificed to idols, now we're going to talk about this, because it just seems like it jumps too fast. It seems like he goes from that one subject to the other subject, because so far in the Bible, trains of thoughts have been pretty complete, and a lot of the writers and the apostles will finish their thought before they move on to something else. So this seems like the thought of food sacrifice to idols hasn't been finished yet. But right now he's talking about having for those who preach the gospel, apostles, having the right to financial support based on what they're doing. Like they can receive a living based on the gospel. That's what Paul is saying right here. So I'm kind of on the train of thought, and I might have to abandon it at some point. But we'll see. But again, that he's still making an argument for food sacrifice to idols. But again, he may have moved on to a different topic. Let's see. So we're on verse 19. Here we go. For since I am free from all, I can make myself a slave to all in order to gain even more people. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to gain the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to gain those under the law. To those free from the law, I became like one free from the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under the law of Christ, to gain those free from the law. To the weak I became weak in order to gain the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that all means I may save some. I do all these things because of the gospel, so that I can participate in it. Do you not know that all the runners in a stadium compete, but only one receives the prize? So run to win the prize. Each competitor must exercise self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run uncertainly or box like one who hits only air. Instead, I subdue my body and make it my slave, so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified. So now I'm thinking he's bringing it back. I'm thinking he's bringing it back to what he's talking about, which is food sacrificed to idols, because the train of thought that I'm thinking is that he's making this argument that, look, as an apostle, I have rights to claim money. I'm preaching the gospel, and just like a priest has a right to the food that comes out, or the meat that is sacrificed to the temple, I have a right to earn a living and earn a wage based on my preaching the gospel. And you guys are kind of my field. You guys are the proof of that. I have that right, and I have a right to take a wife as well. But if those things are making people sin or making people stumble, and it's not achieving the goal, and also I don't want people to be, I don't want to be able to boast in myself. I don't want to be able to say, look at all this money I got. I'm doing this out of not because I feel obligated to, because it's what brings a paycheck, but I'm doing it because it's what I want to do. I'm compelled to do it on my own and not through money. So there's no boasting. And now he's talking about, being a slave to all people and doing what he has to do to meet the needs of all the people. I do all these things because of the gospel, so that I can be a participant in it. And then at that verse 27, instead I subdue my body, and he talks about a runner, and he talks about a boxer, because they have to make themselves physically fit enough for their different sports. They have to subdue their body, and they have to become disciplined. And so that's what Paul is saying. Instead, I subdue my body and make it my slave, so that after preaching to others, I myself not be disqualified. I make sure that I have discipline, and I discipline myself so that the gospel isn't disqualified in my own actions. So that's why I think that Paul is still talking about food sacrificed to idols. I think he's still talking about food sacrificed to idols, and I think his point is that in chapter 9 is that as an apostle, he has rights to collect money, but he doesn't, in order to be more effective. And how does he do that? Through self-discipline. So I think that's what Paul is talking about here in chapter 9. So now, and again, that's pretty quick. A lot of the stuff is being pretty self-explanatory. But now we're going on to chapter 10. let's go on to that. We haven't done a lot of. I'm really surprised we haven't done a lot of. There wasn't a lot of need in going to footnotes. So let's see here. We're in chapter 10. I'm not purposely blowing through this either. Like I'm trying to take my time. I'm trying to make sure I understand this, and so that's what I'm doing. Again, like I definitely welcome if there's anybody that is watching and they're in the comment section of Facebook. Definitely feel free to voice, your opinion. Voice, what you're thinking. If you have any questions, am I missing something that you're thinking about and I'm not thinking about? Let me know, definitely. So here we go. Chapter 10. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. So he's talking about the Exodus here. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were all drinking from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. But God was not pleased with most of them, for they were cut down in the wilderness. These things happened as examples for us, so that we will not crave evil things as they did. So do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now this verse here, if you're not familiar with this verse here, this is in Exodus, and there's a footnote here, right here for 4. So we are going to go into a footnote finally. So we are going to go into a footnote with 10, verse 7 here, 4. So this is Exodus 32, chapter 6, and this is when so Aaron makes the idol. He makes the golden calf, and then you see here, this is what it says in 32:6. This is what the people of Israel are doing. So the next day, so they got up early on the next day and offered up burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. And those burnt offerings and peace offerings they were giving to the golden calf. So that's why he's equating it to idolatry, and that's why he's saying, for it is written the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. It seems like it doesn't make any sense, but if you read it in the context, it does, because context is king when it comes to trying to understand the Bible. So now, verse 8. And let us not be immoral, as some of them were. And 23,000 died in a single day. And let us not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by snakes. And do not complain, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages have come. So let the one who thinks he is standing be careful that he does not fall. No trial has overtaken you that is not faced by others, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tried beyond what you are able to bear, but with the trial will also provide a way out, so that you may be able to endure. Again, no. So he's using Exodus as an example. He's using what happened at Mount Sinai as an example. He's saying those people there, like, they turned their back. They turned their back on God to worship idols. And they're there as an example. They're there as an example of what not to do. God is faithful, he says. He will not let you be tried beyond what you were able to bear, but with the trial will also provide a way so that you may be able to endure it. And again, I still think Paul, because again, like he hasn't broken his train of thought. And this is what I really want to train myself and anybody who's watching who's interested in this. I want to train us to think, has he broken his train of thought? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think he is still talking about food sacrificed to idols. That's what I think that Paul is talking about here. But he's using excess as an example of people turning away from God to do what they please. And I think that's why he uses that verse. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, because they were eating food that was sacrificed to idols. But they were also themselves partaking in idolatry. And in the previous verse, he uses himself as an example to say, "Look, I have rights but I don't exercise them so that I can effectively preach the gospel." And so now we're here, and we're in verse 14 of chapter 10. "So then, my dear friends," he says, "flee from idolatry." So this is definitely connected to this up here. He's telling them, flee from the idolatry. "I am speaking to the thoughtful people. Consider what I say. Is not the cup of blessing that we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread that we break a sharing in the body of Christ?" So now he's coming back to this idea that whenever we drink the cup, whenever we share in his blood, and we break the bread and we share in his body, we're equal. We're all equal. We're all sharing this, because there is one bread. We who are many are one body, for we all share the one bread. Look at the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? So now he's coming back. So now he's coming back to the food sacrificed to idols, and he's saying, look, aren't the people in Israel, when they eat the food sacrificed on the altar, they're partners in that altar. They're partners in that altar. Am I saying that idols or food sacrificed to them amount to anything? No. I mean that what the pagans sacrifice is to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot take part in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or are we trying to provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we really stronger than he is? So now he's coming back to this idea. Food sacrificed to idols, which kind of reinforces this idea that he hasn't broken his train of thought. So everything that he's been saying prior, these aren't separate things. These aren't separate, deals. He's using them as arguments. He's using them as building up his argument to talk about food sacrificed to idols and why you shouldn't partake in it, is what he's saying here. And this is his. So the first one was kind of the people who came from that lifestyle. They came from that lifestyle of eating food sacrificed to idols. They believed that the idols were God. They followed those other gods. Well, we only have one God, so it really doesn't matter whether you eat it or not. Like, it's of no consequence. And I believe he's talking about health-wise. It's no consequence to us, but it does cause those people who came out of that to sin. And if you sin against them, you sin against Christ. And then he goes in to talk about, I have rights, and I don't take part of those because I want my preaching of the gospel to remain pure and to remain beneficial. And what's another word for it? It's productive. That's the word I was looking for. And now he's talking about, how the Israelites, when they came out of Egypt, they were all kind of on the same spiritual footing. They were all, on the same spiritual footing, but they turned their back on God to eat food sacrificed to idols, to partake in idolatry. And so now Paul is saying, do not to flee from idolatry, run away from this kind of acting. Because when we imitate other gods, that's what Paul is saying. So now let's go over here to verse 23. And I think I might end. Let me check real quick. Yeah. I think I'm going to end with chapter 10. So we're not going to read chapter 11. We'll stop here at chapter 10. So at verse 33. Here we go. So now Paul brings back this argument, but everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds others up. So he's saying that, it's like you're not breaking the law. You're not sinning. But that doesn't mean it's beneficial. That doesn't mean that it builds other people up. Here we go in verse 24. Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other person. I see that I'm frozen really quick. Hold on a second. Hold on one second. It says I'm still streaming, so it might just be a Facebook issue because I'm on Facebook. Oh, nope. It says I'm still online. It says I'm still working from my streaming service, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. Yeah, it says I'm still live. Well, whatever. All right, so let's finish up here. We're on the home stretch, and so it's trying to throw me off. That's all it's trying to do. Okay, so 24. Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other person. And then here, verse 25. Eat anything that is sold in the marketplace without question of conscience. So what he's saying here, and he's kind of going back to what he was saying at the very beginning, and that's this question here, because he says we all have knowledge, we all kind of know, and he says if someone thinks he knows something, he does not yet know to the degree that he needs to know. I think that's what he's addressing here with what he's saying here. And he says, eat anything you want without question of conscience. For the earth and its abundance are the Lord's. And if an unbeliever invites you to dinner and you want to go, eat whatever is served without asking questions of conscience. So don't go asking. There he goes. But if someone says to you, this is from a sacrifice, do not eat because of the one who told you and because of conscience. So what he's saying here is he's basically saying, like, if you don't know, then you're not partaking in that idol worship. You don't know if that lamb leg was sacrificed to Molech or Zeus or Apollo. Like, you don't know. And so you're not partaking in that altar. because the Israelites, and this is to go back to that, the Israelites ate from the food that was sacrificed to the golden calf, so they knew that they were partaking in idol worship and in idolatry. They knew what they were doing. And Paul says, flee from that. Flee from idolatry. And then he says in verse 29, I do not mean yours, but the other person's conscience, is what he's saying. Because you don't want to cause other people, like if other people are interested in faith in Christ, and you go and you're starting to eat food sacrificed to other gods, and that's messing with them, then you might become a stumbling block for them coming to Christ. I do not mean yours, but the other person's. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I blamed for the food that I give thanks for? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Do not give offense to Jews or Greek or the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone in all things. I do not seek my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved. And then we're going to read this one verse from chapter 11. Be imitators of me, just as I am of Christ. So all of that, and I'm so glad that I went to 11. I'm so glad that I went, or that I went to I read that 8, 9, and 10. Because see, chapter 7 was so long and it felt like a slog. And that's because it was all about the first issue. And that first issue was about sexual relations, married and unmarried. That's what it was about. That's what Paul was addressing. And so these 3 chapters are all about the same thing. These 3 chapters, so you have 8, 9, and 10. And these chapters are addressing the issue of food sacrificed to idols. Every single line in 8, 9, and 10, and even that one that's in 11, every single verse, every single word is pointed to the issue of food sacrificed to idols. Because that's one thing too, is we hear and it still works when people quote that verse in 1 Corinthians where they talk about, running the race and like that. Like, it still works, but like the reason Paul is saying that is he's talking about, runners run the race to win, but they have to be disciplined. That's what Paul is pointing to. He's pointing to discipline. So let's go through. So chapter 8 talks about the point. Actually, let's just go through points. I don't want to. So chapter 8, Paul talks about. He talks about the conscience, and he talks about this the whole way through, but the conscience of those who came out of idolatry or paganism specifically. So he's talking about the conscience of those who came out of idolatry, and that if you sin against them, it is the same as sinning against Christ. And this sinning it's not just it's just making it's them seeing you as doing something sinful, but it's also you giving them this right to do something that they still feel is idol worship. So like if you're strengthening, this is what Paul says in chapter 8, it says strengthening their conscience, and he calls them weak, and then he says strengthening their conscience. So giving them this kind of, so when they start looking, they go, well, I guess I can eat this food that was sacrificed to Zeus. But the thing is in their heart and in their mind, they still know that this was sacrificed to Zeus, and this is the lifestyle that they came out of. So this food is part of idol worship. And so to sin against their conscience and to make them sin against themselves, you're sinning against Christ by acting in your liberty. That's what Paul is saying here. So you need to watch yourself. And then Paul, I want to make sure I want to make sure that I don't skip over any points in 8. So no, that's what all Paul that's what all Paul is. And then here in 9, Paul talks about his rights as an apostle. And how he lays those aside to be, or he lays those aside so the gospel can be more productive. That's what Paul is saying in here. Paul, and I've actually heard pastors use chapter 9 to say, well, hey, I can totally get a wage because Paul says so, and he does. He does. Paul says it's totally within their rights. But Paul personally does not take a wage from preaching the gospel so that him preaching the gospel can be more productive, so that there's no stumbling blocks, and so it doesn't look as though he's doing it for the paycheck. He's doing it because of the love of the gospel and the love of spreading the gospel. That's what Paul is doing. He says, I have these rights. I have the right to take a wife, a godly wife, but I don't do that so that I can be more effective and more productive in preaching the gospel. That's what he does. He lays down his own ambitions to the side. He lays down his own rights to the side so that he can be more effective in preaching the gospel. And then what else does he talk about here? Okay, so then the next part. He talks about the Exodus. And he uses the Exodus as an example because those people knowingly ate food sacrificed to an idol, and therefore took part in idol worship. So then Paul makes the case based on that. He says, flee idolatry is what he says. Flee idolatry. Run away from it. Don't be a part of it. Flee from idolatry. And then he also, and then he keeps going, and this is the same vein. I'm pointing at the screen as if you can see where my finger is. But in the same vein, he comes back to food that's been sacrificed to idols, and he's saying, yeah, that food sacrificed to like idols and food sacrificed to idols, like they don't have there's no power in it. There's no power in it. But if you willingly partake in it, hold on. So to partake knowingly, and again, this goes back to what Paul says at the very beginning of chapter 8 when he says, we all know things, but sometimes we don't know what we should know. Like, what do we need to know? What we don't need to know. So to partake knowingly in food sacrificed to idols, we'll say, is To partake knowingly in food sacrificed to idols is to partake in food offered to demons. That's what Paul says. If you knowingly partake in food sacrificed to idols, you partake in food that's offered to demons. So then he says everything is lawful. So you're not sinning. You're not sinning if you partake in this food. However, that doesn't make it beneficial because it doesn't build each other up. It doesn't build each other up. And then in verse 24, which is on the screen here, do not seek your own good. Don't only look after your own desires and wants, but look to do what's good for other people. And if you're going to cause that other person to sin, do not partake in that activity. Do not partake in it. And then this is the guidelines that Paul says. He says, look, eat anything that you want that is sold in the marketplace, but don't question it. Don't ask anybody where it came from. Don't ask anything, don't ask about it. Just buy it. Take part of it. And if you're invited to go to an unbeliever's house, if you're invited to go to a Greek's house, then go and eat dinner and don't ask anything about the food. Just eat the food and enjoy it. However, if they look at you and they say, hey, just BT dubs, this food was sacrificed to Apollo. We offered that cow to Apollo. Then do not eat that food. Do not eat that food. And then Paul wraps it up here. Says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Do everything, and this is a better way, well, not a better way. I don't want to say I'm wording it better than the Bible does, but just a way to understand it is do everything for the glory of God, is do everything so that God can be glorified. And that means to not offend anyone. Don't do anything for your own benefit, but do things so that you're not offensive to other people, and do things so that you can glorify God, so that God can be glorified through you. That's the point of 8, 9, and 10. That's the point when they're asked about food sacrificed to idols. And again, 8, 9, and 10, that's all of that. That whole section, 8, 9, and 10, are all addressing this issue of food sacrificed to idols. And now he has finished his train of thought. Now he has finished his train of thought, I believe, as far as goes the issue of food sacrificed to idols. Because again, he started it, like he started his argument, kind of introduced it, then he kind of fleshed it out, and then he synthesized it. So, all right, guys. So that was 1 Corinthians, again, 8, 9, and 10. I'm going to save all of these notes and everything like that. And if you want to partake in these notes, then I can definitely share those with you. I'll probably share them on my Instagram and Facebook for you to check out and see and everything like that. But hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoyed this time, and I'll see you tomorrow when we go over. We're starting chapter 11 and see where we go from there. I don't want to drag this out any longer. I know that I have the tendency to do that. But I'll see you tomorrow, 8 p.m., We're going to be going over 1 Corinthians chapter 11. See you guys later.